We might as well say that we hate the Black family as the Black collective because we're not rushing to promote, create, uplift, support the family. And to love the family isn't just with our words. We must make it the face of us. It's imperative that it becomes the face of us as the only standard of reproduction, because the broken home is not Black empowerment. It's not Black unity. It's not Black community. It doesn't facilitate those values in one household. So let's learn to love the Black family. I know it might be an intimidating image. I know that you're trained to think Black genetics are unworthy, but this deserves to be valued. And we need to stop seeing marriage as a privilege. Hear me out, okay? When I say we should stop seeing marriage as a privilege, I'm not saying that we should devalue marriage. We need to make it accessible. So if you see it as a privilege, that means it's set apart. That means you won't be able to obtain it. It's just for a certain level of us, when it should be for all of us, as many of us who are of marrying age. So we need to see it as, instead of a privilege, a rite of passage, a way of life. Predictability, typicality. We need to see it from a compulsive standpoint. And we need to change the image of us to be wholesome. Wholesome in the connotative sense, so that we look highly moral, so that we look like a people who are aspiring to domesticity, aspiring to the qualities that make us look like we are actual responsible adults. We need to replace the hypersexual image with this wholesome, family-friendly image. And also, when I say wholesome, I also think of wholesome as just seeing ourselves as whole, not this fragmented people. So we have to discover ourselves every generation or trying to learn each other. We should become more approachable to what we actually are together. And I mean like the entire group. And I also think of it, the wholesome narrative, with regards to us as human resources. If we make ourselves more approachable, then we have more access to different people we otherwise wouldn't. So let's say there is a singleness crisis or a shortage of opportune partners. What this culture can't do, another form of us can do. They might be looking for a mate, so we have to make the floodgates of Blackness open up so that we can say, you know what, the quest is to create a family, and which one of you can fulfill that, regardless of your different language or your region in this world, that I can still make life with you. I believe that as a collective, the Black collective, because I'm not going to call us the Black community, we do not act like a community. We're not unified like a community. We're not in an ideal place. So if we say the Black community, when we're seemingly more divided than we've ever been, it would not make any sense. We are not a community. What we have in common, however, is what makes us a collective. And unfortunately, we have the worst things you can get in common. We have self-hate in common. We have mistrust in common. We're all trying to be scattered. We're all trying to make it, but forget everybody else, so to speak. We're not trying to see us in a way that would make us have more kinship with one another. I believe that unity matters. And when I believe in unity, and why I believe we should unite, I believe it in the sense of us merging. When I think of unity, I think of marriage. How else can you unify a bunch of adults? Just putting them in a room somewhere and having them talk? How about, instead of that, having a bunch of adults merge their bloodlines together? And by merging them via marriage, merging their family groups, merging their resources, their knowledge, everything that they innately come with, and all the things that marriage as a merging system creates. Maybe that's what we should be doing. And also, as we marry each other at high rates, increasing our sense of familiarity, because I don't think we know each other right now. And how can we know each other with all the absentee fathers? You know how many decades they're missing out of their children's lives when they're not in their children's lives? And if we're talking generations of people missing their children's life, generations of people missing how to pair bond in what should have been a long-term commitment with their spouse, then you don't really know your people. Because if every generation and with every household there is this leaving of the family, how can you truly become entrenched in them and knowing the nuances of them? And that strangeness that's developing between us so that we're becoming strangers is also increasing with our lack of real unity at all. So we're strangers because there's so much absence, and we're strangers because there's not enough being able to pair bond or even collectively see pair bonding commitments. And we also are losing our sense of values, our values. Because for many, there is this belief that there is no us. It's just I. And all of this is a construct. And you shouldn't care about blase blah. Obviously, that's not being practiced by any other demographic, because if that were the case, there would not be the concept of the wealth gap. A wealth gap disproves all these silly arguments that everything goes. Because entire populations, not individuals within populations, collectively possess wealth more so than other populations. And so the wealth gap not only divides one group from another, but it proves that all groups operate as groups, whether they choose to or not. In our case, unintentionally, but definitely it is intentional in highly married demographics that are not us. We don't have love for each other. We don't have support. We don't have empathy, but marriage and creating nuclear families at extremely high rates, and then also creating a culture that idealizes us and unifies us would have given us those things. Unity has to matter innately. We have to find the innate root to what unity is, which I would think if you see the value in your DNA and somebody else shares it and they're closely related to that somehow, that gives you a sense of purpose. When you compare other groups and how unified they are and their high marriage rates, that should give you a map as to what we're missing out on. When you look at the historical errors that happened, that we dropped the ball in some cases, or in other cases occurred with us, you don't want those things to repeat. So we have to learn how not to be in a vulnerable position again. And the more fragmented, the more vulnerable. When you look at the law of nature and just assessing other living beings, from animals to looking at other human beings, and you seeing that they tend to operate in groups so that they can forage for resources and better survive, that should tell you why unity is important. When you think about having support systems so that we as a group can have our best interests met, look at all the crises going on just at once affecting us, from water crises to people having issues with their infrastructure, their schooling systems, and etc. Think of how that causes our lives to be depleted of worth and value. So we needed support systems in one another. And think about the existential loneliness. We're making it difficult for us to have a place to be at peace because we're not giving each other any refuge, and we're not seeing refuge given to us outside of us. Why do we have to keep getting worse in our condition when the center of our dialogue should be about unifying us? It's time we get serious about Black unity, especially with regards to domestic affairs and how that reverberates. I believe that we have racial dysphoria in the sense that we are not content with who we are called to be, who we are supposed to look like, how we sound like. We're losing our flavor. We're losing our heritage and what makes us unique. And we're losing this because we're disunited. You have people that bash us all the time, and they are our own demographic. But also this lack of marriage. It's making us strangers. We're not as familiar and family friendly. We don't see ourselves as a family. We're just by consequence relatable. Yet there is power in being able to feel united and relating. There is power in imagery. There is power in representation. And that power is best reflected in the ease at which you would otherwise feel when you contrast that against the world outside of us and how you may not feel as welcome there. And we need to start establishing a greater sense of kinship, because within kinship is incentive. You cannot expect us to feel incentivized in uniting if you give us nothing. If you're disloyal in the sense of bashing, if you're disunited, what are we otherwise going to feel one with? We have to establish oneness. You can't expect it to innately exist. You have to give people reason to believe in their value, in your value, in what is our value. Because we're not going to see ourselves in the total sense of the word until there's work done to enable us. The conversation of empowerment should stop being so outside, because people act like they have everything figured out within us, and they don't. So when they talk about empowerment from the angle of what other groups think about us or what other groups are doing to us, they act like you can come home to a safe space, but everything else needs to be figured out. No, you barely got your own houses in order. You barely got your own marriages at all, let alone intact. So until we can figure out each other, because there is a strangeness within each other, until we can figure out how to deal with that, then we don't need to really have any interest in anything else. We have to familiarize ourselves with each other via mass abundance of marriage, because marriage affirms unity as the basis of small-scale unity, and as it increases across populations, what ties a population together. Because when you marry within us, you're affirming your group. You may not see it that way, but you are. You're affirming us through that choice of saying, well, we are a people. We are one people. It's one thing to be able to look at someone and feel relatable. It's another thing when we choose on our own behalf to validate that relatability by uplifting our group, by marrying our group, by creating families with our group, which is what we need to do. Incentive comes to mind when I think about unity, when I think of the Black family, because we can't expect our people, who many of which are highly intelligent, incredibly educated, incredibly successful, incredibly powerful in their own rights, creative, they have great qualities. We can't expect them to be full of respect and trust for us when we're not even in our condensed forms in healthy families, and we're not even providing each other a safe space. So naturally, they're going to be concerned about us. I don't think it's shocking if they think of us in a negative light, because we haven't given them anything to feed on. We haven't given them a basis so that we can respect each other's safe zones and bodies and homes and qualities. We aren't even giving our children incentive, so that's got to change. I love that we have held on so much. I love that we work together in certain ways, but it's cosmetic. And I'm really tired of empowerment conversations that are just about the vain images, or even this outside-in approach to empowerment where we talk about what others are doing against us. At some point, we have to center ourselves in this conversation of what are we doing wrong and how do we fix it? Because from my perception, how are we going to rise and unite and see the validity in us if we're super breeders? Breeding as if it's a job, breeding as if you're trying to fill a population quota. And then there's no written values between that. As adult men and women, you're doing a disservice. You're not giving an incentive to your kids when you're not giving them a family structure, an intact home. And when people do not have values for themselves, they're not giving their partner an incentive. Because you're breeding, but you're not married. You're breeding, but you're not trying to get married. With all the breeding Black people do, you would think they would be highly married, knowing that having children is not innately meaningful. I'm just going to be honest, because what is the outcome of having a child outside of a suitable context that would benefit it, knowing that psychologically, materially, and in any capacity of their human activity, they benefit from the intact family structure. So what is the point of just simply creating Black lives that will hate themselves, hate each other, and go on to potentially create more broken homes or just contribute to the bash fest? What's the point of this? See, the incentive to the Black family isn't just that it exists, it's combating the broken home model. It's combating our sense of strangeness because we are becoming strangers to each other. We are becoming disassociated and individualistic. It's combating all of that. It's also combating the idea that unity is innate, that just because you share particularities that somehow that's enough to determine our likelihood to get along. No, it's not. If we don't see people that are in their children's lives and seeing pair bonding on a high level and seeing how that works and how that influences our mental health, we're not going to trust each other at all. In other words, we got to see each other loving on each other, loving on our children, loving on our spouses. We got to see that in each other before we can respect each other. We have to see in each other that high sense of duty to the family before we can feel safe nesting in our own collectives. And we have to see that not one and done and sporadically. We have to see that across generations. And we have to see a commitment to us as we renovate ourselves with time. Commitment to the household, commitment to the collective, commitment to family, commitment to unity. But it has to be all comprehensive. We have to be determined to fulfill it, not with the blame game, but with the point of restoration. If you want us to unify, we need incentive. More families is the incentive. Your presence in the home is the incentive. Getting along, working together is the incentive. I'm not going to bash my own demographic for our lack because I'm in it. We're all in it. You're not alone in this. We're all in it together. But we got to build that togetherness before we can even feel that safety in numbers approach. You know what's strange about our population is we don't have deficits numerically with regards to an imbalance of the biological sex ratio. Other demographics, because they have put stipulations on the amount of people being born, they have to deal with this issue. Or if they're having lowered birth rates, they have to deal with this issue. But we don't seem to lack in terms of opportunities within us. You're the demographic that, despite all of your chaos, somehow still exists. You're the demographic that, despite all of your hindrances, still has life, and in a more massive amount than what your oppression would make you think was possible. It's so ironic about us. But the irony furthers when you take into consideration that you're also the demographic that is not marriageable, despite having access to many individuals that you can mate with and pair bond with. The issue for us in terms of marriageability is not whether a populace has a certain amount of appearances to choose from, because we are a populace with many beautiful people, and beauty being a complex wording. It doesn't have to be the conventional norms that are typically against our genetics, but that there is beauty in us, and mainly we have to strive to see it, but the beauty is in our humor, our music, our dancing. So many elements of us are beautiful. So there is marriageability just on the visual / cosmetics / consumption basis of humanity. But marriageability is deeper than aesthetics, because do you think every non-black person, considering how high their marriage rates, that's covering a large expanse of people, do you think they're all conventionally attractive couples? Do you think they're so vain? No. There's a high range of them that are married. Whatever kind of couple you're looking for, they possess it. It's like a marriage depot. Marriageability is simply numerically aligning to the population so that you can create as many married people as the population would endow. The more married a population, the more marriageable they are. And you also have to understand the complexity of how marriage socializes you to be used to marriage. Because if you're non-black, you grow up in a world where you're raised in a married home. You're seeing married homes all around you. It's in your media. It's in your blogs. It's in the culture that's affirmed within you. So that makes marriage accessible in your mind. You feel like you're highly likely to be married. You feel like it's the expectation. So marriageability allows you to expect marriage. It allows you to know it's for you. It's not something that is seen as unapproachable, rather something predictable. We have to understand that with other demographics, they don't just get married, they create a culture around marriage. Anything from their media to their blogs, everything that you can get as a consumption, they use it to affect marriage, ideally in a positive way. They don't even make it a choice if you think about it, with all that they inundate themselves with. And you can even look at their phrases and how they define marriage. They make phrases such as tie the knot, getting hitched, popping the question, getting your better half, settling down, the big day. They have different phrases that they create and different ways they communicate marriage and family to make it heartwarming, to make it pleasant, to make it seem like, you know what, this is an aspiration. This is something you're supposed to do. They deeply feed on marriage. And it would be nice if we could learn from that, because the way we communicate marriage, the way we discuss, do we ever discuss domesticity? Do we ever discuss or have forums or support groups or platforms where we choose as a group to discuss preparing for the role of marriage? Rather than the bashing fests, why don't we as a people address our complexities so that we can combat those things and then create families? Why wasn't that a thing at large? Because the anti-family, anti-marriage rhetoric in our group, the anti-unification, anti-communication, anti-order rhetoric, it's, I believe, contributing to the broken homes. Whereas if you compare other groups and how pro-marriage they are and all the things they are creating to validate marriage, that is creating more families for them. You can't just think that they are likely to just get married. They're also being spoon-fed in their culture, in their ways of life, imagery, words, solutions to help benefit marriage. It's an entire culture of pro-marriage. Let us learn from that. Let us be pro-marriage like them, not just say, oh, let's get married, but also infusing ourselves with the identity of marriage. And let's ask ourselves the question, why do they marry so much? Because we get it. They're enculturated. They see it everywhere. They grew up in that dynamic, so they're going to reflect that in their own choices. But we also have to ask that because they have problems, they have issues, they have the battle of the sexes as well, but they just don't take it to a demented level. So why is it that with all the battle of the sexes and all the political associations and all the policy changes and anything that could go wrong, they still haven't defeated the family? Whereas with us, you have people in our demographic that try to analyze the breakdown of the black family, and yet other groups haven't had a breakdown of the white family or breakdown of the Asian or Hispanic family, because whatever issues they have, they never let it break down the domestic ability for them to rise. They created ways around anything that could break down the home. And in doing that, they reflected in societies that benefited wealth, benefited unity, benefited any capacity that we do not have. Look at what they possess, and you will see how the household is tied to that. It sounds to me like they like being together. They like having nurturing, cozy homes where they are with their spouse. They don't seem to epitomize vices and self-destruction like we do. They seem to epitomize nurturing and basking in kindness and softness and gentleness. Why? Because if they can do it and they have more to lose because they're infrastructurally that much more dominant, then what do we have as an excuse? Get this. They're part of the reason why, and this is as per the Pearl source, the wedding industry is $60 billion each year. They're part of that. In massive part because they're getting married more than us. You know, it's an industry. You're helping so many people obtain wealth just by getting married. The wedding industry, which is comprised of vendors such as the cake vendors and people who have venues that they rent out and people who create fashion for the wedding and so on and so forth. They're making so many people have opportunities in life just by getting married. And we can't even seem to do that. You know how many people we could help out of multi-generational poverty just with marriage alone? How many people could have went into the wedding industry creating wedding dresses, maybe put their unique touch on it, specific to our collective? It's interesting how marriage isn't just the two parties, but how it reverberates in their larger sanctity, their larger complexity, their larger wealth. Wealth materially, wealth of mind, wealth of intellect, wealth of resources, etc. And why don't we like being together anyway? You would think we would, considering all the begging and pleading. You'll see people make videos and commentary and forums and discussing, why don't they like us? Why don't other groups like us? You don't even like you, but you want to know why they don't. Never mind the fact that not only you don't even like you, but you should like you. And I would think the problem isn't why don't they like you? They like themselves. They like their families. They like marrying. They like unity. They have this sense of contentment with who they are. My question is, where is that for us? Because if we had more time doing that, we wouldn't have to ask what we've done to be hated, because we wouldn't have done anything to be loved. We would have loved where we need to love, which is ourselves and our wholesome, beautiful families. When I compare the Black nuclear family with non-Black nuclear families, I will have to be very thorough about this, from phenotype to cultures to what I observe as their confidence. They are very different from us. And I believe that that's large in part because they're not just married per household. Their entire identity is married to confidence. It's married to seeing the beauty within themselves. They have, on every level of what you would connote marriage to represent, a highly married way of thinking. So they're loyal to their best interests. They're loyal to their family structures. It doesn't matter if it's a blonde nuclear family or a redhead nuclear family. It doesn't matter what kind of white nuclear family. Whereas with us, we have colorism to contend with. With us, we have texturism and featureism and cultural biases and cultural wars that we possess against each other. And there are other deviancies that we have, so that we are clearly not globally united, so that we are clearly not united across the range of us. Now, the beauty of us is, if there is a range of us that you can choose from, then you should be able to validate that and to see the beauty within that, and you should be able to work together in the midst of that. But the problem is, we have not taken it to the point where we can harness our diverse elements to make it a part of us, but another stage of us that makes us incredible, another stage of us that adds flavor, another stage of us that adds texture and range to our greatness. Now, instead of it seeing it in a negative connotation, we should understand that there should be a high range of Black families to choose from, particularly the nuclear family. And I believe this would be adjusted if we could start marrying at higher rates, but also on top of the household marriage, add to that and marry our group. So symbolically, the term marry, as in bringing together our identities. And I think that would flip the script so that our families would have a culture that defined the entire race. So that our families, it had a culture that defined what we want to represent as a global network. The family is the foundation. And if it wasn't, then why are those other groups? They have high marriage rates and everything also comes with that. They don't seem to look outside of themselves for worth as much as we will. So we have to change the narrative. I believe that we should rebuild the Black family and not just let it go to waste. Because partly there are Black families. And so they give us hope if somehow in the midst of all this discouragement they exist. We're not talking in the ones and twos. They make a small percentage, but they make an amount of us that, unless they did some kind of a phone call agreement, is pretty massive considering our typical pitfalls. So if there's a way for them to have broken out of the dysfunction, then they can be the post in which we decide, hey, we can learn from. So they give us hope. They give us meaning. They give us solution in a sense because they didn't have to make that choice and somehow they did. So anytime I see idealism, let's hold on to that. And say, hey, well, if they did it, maybe we can as well. So when you see all these Black families, that is our interpretation and cue to knowing that it's possible that they can be rebuilt. Person to person, household to household, couple to couple. We can add that up. We got to make it a movement. We got to make it a standard. We got to make it a norm, but we can get there because some people already have. We didn't get to this position of so many broken homes overnight. Took a few decades. So we can actually, if we got to this point in decades, it's not innate, it's not normal, then we can make a new standard and have the nuclear family become normal. It's just a matter of solutions, though. We have to assess our solutions. And we know there are solutions if there are problems. We know there are solutions because there are examples of families that stand in the way of the problem of the broken home. We know there are solutions because, we are a persevering people. We have our low points. We get beat down. We get hurt. We get drained. We hit the bottom rung of our own minds. We know the lows as a people, but somehow we still exist. Somehow, even in the midst of the lows, we've been through some serious times as a people. We've been through some extreme times as a bloodline. Somehow, we still are here. Let's draw from that energy and create within ourselves the wellspring of hope. Because if we continue to complain, we have all these things, we're not being able to brainstorm ideals. Complaining takes its own sense of time. So when do we say, okay, let's have a meeting, let's figure this out? We need to get in the mindset of solutions versus complaints. We need to rebuild the Black family. Our order, our kindness, our sanctity, our values, our hope, our meaning, our qualitative sentience depends on the rebuilding of the Black family. Listen, there are many benefits to the Black family structure. And you can see that there are many benefits to it because without it, there are many dysfunctions. I know we like to think that our people are just demonically infused, but it's really just cause and effect. They do not have healthy parentage. They don't have fathers. And in many instances, it's not even just that they don't have fathers. They can't really have a full-time mother if the mother is the one that's carrying all the load and she has to do the provision. So they don't really have parents. So all these kids in compromised families where they don't really have time for either parent, one being totally overburdened, the other fleeing, they grow up and they become destroyed as a result. So we know that this is a problem. We know that there is a benefit to the family structure. Then we need to create more families so that we're not just birthing recklessly into oblivion, but we are creating wholesome, healthy human beings. And in that model, where we know we need to create more Black families, we have to see Black people as a resource. Because we could stay divided and vulnerable, or we could be united and a lot stronger with a bunch of intact, united Black families. Black families united in their own homes, Black families united across each other's families. That's a greater world for us. And we can also be resources in the home by actually being there, by actually getting married, giving our children that shot at that family structure, breaking that generational dysfunction of the broken home. But if we're going to see ourselves as resources and use each other as resources, then we need to have access to circulating those resources. I propose that we as a group need more forums and gatherings and support groups and events, matchmaking events, so that people can have access to someone they can create a family with. It seems like the problem is people do not feel like there's enough to choose from, or that there aren't really people around them that they can relate to. Maybe we can find ways to use the internet / physical places so that we can really deal with what I perceive is a marriage crisis. Let's get serious about this marriage crisis. If it's the only thing in our control, you may not be able to control material resources, but you can control the outcome of being able to create families. If it's the only thing in our control, we need to do much so that we can deal with this deficit. It's not a silly proponent to actually care about our population and its integrity and the value of it and people having access to marriage. People cannot keep downplaying the structural value that marriage plays. Families in our demographic are rare, which is unfortunate because as beautiful as they are, as incredible as they are, as necessary and functional as they are, we don't see them too often, which means the quality of us is depleted. We have to increase our social value. We have to increase our economic value, our sense of relatability to our own DNA. Everything about self-love, we have to start it on every level. We can't just pick and choose and say, well, this is a nice level of self-love. We have to have a love in the home, loving families in the home. They have to become the dominant family group. No more should the broken home and one parent be relevant to our race. We're not going to be lorded over by one parent. We need numerous parents, married parents, to be the face of us. And they have to take over the culture so that we can have, let's say, 90 to 99% of married families. If we can get that 100%, then great. But maybe some people, they don't desire pair bonding, so we got to leave them the option. But for those who are going to pair bond, that should be the standard, no arguments. Because there is nothing beneficial about broken homes. So it has to get to the point where there's a nuclear family for everyone. You all have access to your mate. You pair bond, you make family together. That's the quest. That's the assignment. That's what you should fulfill. As soon as you're of marrying age, as soon as you're able to have access, you find your person, you make a family together. And we don't have to pick a hierarchy within the families. And we don't have to assume that some families are better than others. We can make what you see for other populations where whether they are monarchy or your run-of-the-mill blue-collar worker, they still have families. So it doesn't matter what you range in terms of your class, in terms of your quote levels. You're still tied to this greater influence of the family structure. And I'm sure that's going to make a great difference for these offspring. It would enhance our sense of self-love in ways that we've never before seen in a very long time, if ever, because we've come through a lot. The ubiquity of families is anywhere you see us, there has to be a high percentage of nuclear families. Anywhere on Earth that we are, there has to be a high percentage of nuclear families. Which means that if you see a high percentage of nuclear families and it takes over the entire image, that means you have the new standard of reproduction. So that reproduction isn't haphazard. It's not surprise. It's not unwanted. It's not something that you did not prepare for. And if you didn't, you'd still be with your partner that you are raising those children with in marriage. Reproduction will have to take on a new connotation of something only done within marriage. And anything less, we would have to change the tone of that to seeing it as tacky. We have to see it as gross. We have to see it as hostile. We have to see it as evil. We have to make reproduction in marriage, reproduction with your specific mate, the norm. Reproduction in marriage becomes the norm when marriage becomes the norm. You cannot make reproduction have a higher sense of respect or esteem if marriage isn't esteemed. So it has to be synonymous, one and the same. And families have to become the representation of our group. They are the small-scale rendition of what we want as a total sense of unity. The family represents the opposite sexes getting along. It represents parents and their children, so that's different generations. It represents this small-scale group of Black people, and if you can get that household in check, that becomes the image of us, then I think naturally we would want to relate on a large scale. And when you create these families, don't be obsessed with how to change other people's perception of you. The only perception that needs to change when we're talking about empowerment is our perception of ourselves. Same world, but just more families. Same world, but just more unity within ourselves. We're not looking to change anything but ourselves. Sending high esteem, love, joy, happiness, and peace towards the Black nuclear family. Restoration and peace. Joy and love. The Black nuclear family is here, and it's making a comeback as well. Thanks so much for listening. My name is Gershly Karen Pierre. Stay tuned for more.